All right, next up, let's change how the user controls the camera. Instead of using orbit control, when you click and drag, we are going to create a more immersive experience. The camera moves automatically as the user moves their mouse around the screen. To set this up, we will create a new component and let's call it rig.tsx. And then in here, I'm going to run ref and let's remove the import React. This component will handle all the logic for linking our camera to the mouse movement. All right, in here, instead of div, I'm going to return use from React 3 fiber. And use frame going to take a callback function which has a state property and a delta. And then in here, we're going to call easing. Now to power this camera rig with some really useful math utilities, we need to install a package called math. So let's jump over to the terminal and get that installed. So in here, I'm going to say npm install math with double A. All right, there we go. Now let's close that up. Now right at the top, let's remove this. And right at the top, we're going to import easing from math. There we go. Now let's say easing.damp3, which is for 3D environment. And then in here, we're going to take camera position, which is a vector 3. So let's say state.camera.position. And after that, for the second parameter, you actually take the position itself, the X, Y, and Z. So we're going to say state.pointer.x, which is the mouse movement of x-axis. And then we're going to multiply it by 0.5. After that, for the y-axis, we're going to set it on the 0.7. And then for the z-axis, we're going to say 3 minus math.absolute state.pointer.x. And then we're going to multiply it by 0.2. For the third parameter, which is the smooth time, we're going to set it to 1. And finally, we're going to set the delta right over here. Here we go. And after that, we need to set the camera to look at this position. State.camera.look at this position, 0, 0.7, 0. All right, now let's add this component into our view canvas. So instead of orbit control, let's comment this out because maybe later on we're going to use this orbit control. And then right below this orbit control, we're going to add the rig. There we go. As you can see, it is actually far away. So we need to bring the camera closer to the shirt. For the canvas, we're going to say camera is equals to a position of 0, 0.7, 3. And for FOV, we're going to set to 30. Now let's refresh that again. And here we go. Now, as you can see, it is actually responsive to our mouse movement. All right, next, we need to make each and every single shirts hoverable so that whenever the user hovers over a shirt, the specific studio shows up. All right, now let's head back to the main studio model.tsx. And then in here, for the white shirt, we're going to implement an event, which is called onPointerInter. This is actually similar to the onMouseInter for the div element. So for the onPointerInter, we're going to create a handler. We're going to say inter handler. And right at the top, all right, now let's define that function by calling a function inter handler. And then we're going to set the document.bodyStyle.cursor equals to a pointer. There we go. All right, now whenever you hover over this white shirt, our cursor gets pointer. There we go. All right, now we need to define the onPointerLeave as well. So let's do that. Let's say onPointerLeave equals to leave handler. And I'm going to duplicate this. And let's say leave handler. I misspelled the handler here. Handler, there we go. Now we're gonna make this pointer to auto. Okay, now what we need to do is when the mouse got entered to that white shirt, we're gonna make the environment to white. So as you can see, the studio currently is using the default studio, which is if I head to the public textures main, you can see that it is currently using this texture. So whenever the mouse got entered to the white shirt, we're going to make the studio to this color. So what we need to do is we need to set up a state hook. So I'm going to create a USSS to create a useState snippets for me. All right, now let's create a environment material. For the initial value, I'm going to set it to mats.defaultStudio. And what is this type of useState? The type is 3.mesh basic material because it is returning a 3.mesh basic material. All right, now let's import that useState hook. There we go. All right, now what we got to do is I'm going to copy this and then I'm going to put it inside this function by saying whenever the mouse got this entered, we're going to take that material and put it right here. And what is the type of material? 3.mesh basic material. Okay, now we need to invoke it. The material is mats.whiteStudio. Let's refresh it. Now, as you can see, it is not working because we didn't set the environment. It is currently using the mats.defaultStudio. All right, now after that, we need to copy this and put it right over here. There we go. Now let's refresh that again. Whenever I hover over a white shirt, you can see that it becomes white. All right, now whenever the mouse got leave, we're going to say set environment material to mats.defaultStudio. Let's try this out. Beautiful. Now we need to implement the onPointer enter and onPointer leave for these two shirts as well. So what we're going to do is we need to again copy all of this, paste it right over here. And this time we're going to say mats.redStudio, and for the gray one, we're going to say mats.grayStudio. And let's refresh that again. Beautiful. Now, as you can see, when the mouse is between this little gap, it suddenly changed the texture to default studio suddenly. We don't want this. So that's the reason why I actually add this white box. If I make this to true, you can see that if the mouse is already inside this box, we don't need to change the studio texture. So instead of writing onPointer leave on each and every single one of them, we're going to say here onPointer leave. When the mouse is left from this box, we're going to set the environment to default studio. So let's say, I'm going to say set environment mats.defaultStudio. Here we go. Now we don't need to use this set environment variable here. Let's refresh that again. Beautiful. All right. Now, as I spoke earlier, you can see that we are actually duplicating ourselves here. So instead of doing this, we need to create a shirts and store these position, rotation materials and the hover state into a variable. So let's do that. Right below this textures and mats, I'm going to create a variable by saying const shirts is equals to an array, and this arrays contains an object. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy the geometry, the position, rotation, and the material, and then paste that right over here. Now we need to do some cleanups here. So let's get rid of this curly braces. Okay. Now let's add the comma at the end, and then we need to change the equals to colon. Okay. After that, I'm going to bring the geometry down so that it actually be with the material. All right, let's also create a hover mat by saying the first one would be for the white shirt. So let's say mats.whiteStudio. And let's create also a slug by saying white. Now let's duplicate this again. 1, 2. All right, now after that, we need to change the position to 0, 0.7, and then 0. And for the rotation, we're going to set this to 0 as well. And this time it is actually using geometry to, sorry, this one, nodes.shirtsport.geometry. Okay, now the material is actually using sport shirt. And when it got hovered, it's gonna use the red studio. Let's change it to sport. For the gray one, we're gonna set it to minus 0.65 and positive 0.45. And then for the rotation, we're gonna make that reversed minus by adding a minus. And this one would be the gray one by saying shirt gray. And then let's say match dot gray shirt and then dot gray studio. Okay, let's change that to gray. All right, beautiful. Now after that, we need to iterate through these shirts. So I'm just gonna remove these 3 shirts and then I'm gonna say shirts.map. And let's say it'll take one single shirt with the current index, and then it'll return, instead of adding the curly brace, I'm gonna say parentheses to indicate the return. All right, now within the parentheses, we're gonna set the self closing mesh. And then let's say key is equals to an index. And let's set the geometry equals to shirts.geometry. And the material is equals to shirt.material. Position equals to shirt.position. And then for the rotation equals to shirt.rotation. As you can see, the position of the gray shirt is not properly defined. So let's make that minus 0.45. Okay, here we go. As you can see, it is now complaining about being an array. So let's fix that by saying as number. Let's duplicate it again. Let's copy this and let's paste that right over here. For this one. Okay, there we go. Now we're fine. So let's define those events. Right here, I'm gonna say on pointer inter handler. I'm gonna take a shirt dot hovered map. Let's also define the on pointer leave handler. That's all. Now, as you can see, everything is just working normally. All right, after that, let's add the GSAP animation. Whenever you hover over a shirt, the shirt scales up. So for that, we need to install a GSAP. So let's say npm install GSAP app gsap/react. Now let's create a use GSAP hook, which is coming from the GSAP. By saying use GSAP, and then within it, we're gonna take these meshes. So right here, I'm gonna say ref is equals to take that mesh, and then we're gonna say if the mesh wasn't available, return it. Otherwise, we're gonna set mesh refs dot current with this current index and then m. So basically saying put this mesh inside this mesh ref with this current index. So let's define that mesh. All right, right below this use state hook, let's create a const mesh refs is equals to use refs. Now the type can be a 3.mesh or can be a null, which is an array. And then for the initial value, we're gonna set it to an empty array. Here we go. Now let's copy this mesh refs. Now within the GSAP, we're gonna say if the mesh ref dot current wasn't available, return it. Otherwise, we're gonna iterate through the mesh. So let's say mesh refs dot current dot for each loop, and then we're gonna take each and every single mesh with the current index. And then for the body, we're gonna say if the mesh again wasn't available, return it. Otherwise, we're gonna create a GSAP timeline by saying GSAP, make sure import that correctly from GSAP dot timeline. And then we're gonna pause that because we don't want this animation to be played as an initial. So basically saying we want to store this timeline inside a variable so that we can use it in enter handler and leave handler. So let's create a variable so that we can store this timeline. So here I'm gonna create a use ref by saying const till refs is equals to, we're gonna store timelines for each mesh. As you can see, we have 3 meshes, and then we're gonna store 3 different animations into this timeline. So let's say use ref For the initial value, it is an empty object. And the type would be GSAP timeline. It is an array. All right, now let's copy this timeline ref. And then let's say tlref.current with this index is equals to this GSAP.timeline. And let's create that animation by saying timeline.toMesh.rotation. And then we're going to set the Y 0 with the duration of 1 second and with ease of power in out. And then let's actually scale this shirt up by saying mesh.scale. And let's make the X to scale up by 1.05 and the Y to 105. And then again, Z to 105. Let's define the duration by 1 second and ease of power 1 in out. All right. Now what we got to do here is that we need to start this at the same time with this one. Since we are using the timeline, we're going to say start this at the same time with the previous one. All right. Now once it is all stored in this timeline.refs, we're going to bring it to our handler. So we're going to say tl.current with this current index dot play. We're going to play that animation when the mouse cursor entered one of these shirts. So let's define that index as well. So index would be a number. And then let's define a tlrefs.current with index.reverse. We're going to reverse that animation. So let's actually copy this and then put it right here. All right, now as you can see, it is complaining about the indexes. So let's say index and then index. Here we go. Now let's refresh that. As you can see, it is scales up. And then when you leave the pointer, it scales down. The animation got reversed. So as you can see for this one, so let's actually make that bigger so that you guys can see it better. When you hover over this shirt, it scales up a little bit and then it rotates to the 0 position. Beautiful.